I'm going to do something a little different this time. This is called Cold Opening. We'll get to the theme song in a moment. Larry King passed away in January. Larry King, legendary talk show host, personality. For me, Larry King was the mysterious, deep, gravelly voice coming out of my radio in the middle of the night. Back then, this is a long time ago, Larry hosted an all-night national call-in show. That man, Larry King, one reason yours truly found himself on the radio at a young age as well. Larry was a major influence, and I wish him Godspeed. Our cell phones are silenced. The wine is ready to pour. Hopefully you've gotten yourself some, unless you're driving. And just like that, the podcast is underway. Welcome to episode 3 of the Tall Mike Wine Podcast. I am Mike Stone, the tall Mike and namesake of the show. I'm in the wine business. I work at Nicholson Ranch Winery in Sonoma, California. We record the show here. We're in the vintner's room once again. I'm going to introduce my guest in a few moments, but first, let me enjoy the moment here. Episode 3. I was honestly never sure there was going to be an episode 1 until I made it happen. So 3 seems epic. And my guest this time is our first repeat guest, the one and only Deepak Gulrajani, the owner and winemaker here at Nicholson Ranch. Hi, Deepak.
Hey, good afternoon.
It is a good afternoon. We're recording the show on a beautifully sunny Friday afternoon here in Sonoma. It is the Friday prior to the Super Bowl. Now, you are probably listening to this podcast after the Super Bowl because after recording, there is editing. And even if I get my act together, it probably won't be done until sometime Sunday. So maybe you're actually listening to the podcast instead of watching the big game. I won't ask you for a prediction, Deepak, but do you have any thoughts on the Super Bowl?
My only thoughts, and I'm not a big football fan, but with Tom Brady, again, getting back into the Super Bowl, when he sort of was supposed to be retiring down to sunny Florida and actually getting fired up again. I'm much older than Tom Brady, but I'm rooting for the old guy.
Well, it's so strange because I'm an avid Seattle Seahawks fan, and I pay attention to the NFL during this season, and it was on my radar that Brady had left the Patriots, and then he showed up in Tampa. And in my own mind, I thought, okay, this is like semi-retirement. He's just keeping his hand in the game. He's just going to bide some time. But, he won a few. He lost a few during the season, but he ended up in the playoffs. And then Tom Brady showed up and got his team to the Super Bowl.
One fun trivia is Tom Brady actually grew up and played high school ball here in the Bay Area.
That's right.
In a small town called San Mateo.
That's right. He's a local product. In a few minutes, we're going to dive into a full-on tasting of multiple wines. The February Wine Club releases for the Nicholson Ranch Wine Club. And if you're in the club, welcome to the podcast. But first, I want to give a few fun podcast facts. Now that I'm a podcaster, I've been doing a little bit of reading about podcasts, and I've actually listened to a few podcasts about podcasting.
To interject, you have another brand new entrant in the podcast world as of today. Mr. Mike Pence is going to be starting a podcast up. So, you're in good company.
Wow. What competition. The other night, I was listening to a podcast with people who talk about making podcasts. It's interesting. The one thing I took from this podcast that I found the most fascinating was that some people, in order to fit more hours into their days, listen to podcasts slightly speeded up. There is a feature, I guess, I've never really looked at it, on all the podcast apps where you can set how fast you want to listen. So you can listen at regular speed, which is 1, or you can speed it up a little. You can go 1.3.
Never heard of this. I heard of speed reading.
I don't know if it speeds it up and makes us sound like
Donald Duck?
Chipmunks. I'm not sure. I found that so interesting. So if you're listening to us faster than a regular, I hope we don't sound like Mickey Mouse. Oh, and a couple of other things. There are a few mysterious cities in the world that pop up on pretty much everyone's data location page. So where I thought I had people in Westlake Stevens, Washington, which is a tiny little unincorporated area outside of Seattle, we've had a few downloads from there. It's some quirk, some internet data point that pings from another location. So we have 3 downloads from there, but it's highly unlikely that anyone is actually listening in Westlake Stevens, Washington.
I think there are some wine lovers in Westlake Stevens as well. So.
Hopefully. And I found out that the area of Paris, where we have a couple of downloads, that might not exist either. One of the smaller podcasting apps has some hardware in an area of Paris that kind of shows up like, oh, you've got a listener in Paris, but it's actually just the hardware that's, I don't know how it works. There's just so much about this that I don't understand because it's all computers and high tech. Let's jump into the wines. We have a few to taste, but before we do, I want to kind of explain for somebody listening that is not a member of a winery wine club what the deal is with wine clubs. If you've been tasting at almost any winery, anywhere, at some point somebody will mention their wine club to you. Most wineries have wine clubs. So Deepak, tell me why that is.
Well, when I started the winery many years ago, I don't recall exactly how we started up the wine club. I'm sure 20 years ago, the concept did exist. I certainly didn't invent it. But 20 years ago, people didn't think of wine clubs as a thing. It was, some additional aspect of what you did in the wine business. You primarily had a tasting room. People came in, tasted wine. Right. You sold them some wine. You sold some wine to restaurants. You sold some wine to a distributor who went and sold it to a fine wine shop in our case. And that's how 20 years ago we sold wine. We started up this concept called a wine club, which was essentially a subscription service. Mm-hmm. People who loved our wine and were repeat buyers, we wanted to entice them to stay repeat buyers. And so we offered them a discount on the wine, anywhere from 10 to 20% off the price of the wine, to become a regular customer, a member of the wine club, and receive our wine 4 times a year. Turned out to be a rotating selection of wines from what we produced. And at that point, we just had one wine club. Over time, as people have suggested, some people drink only red wine. So somebody said, may I get red wines only? And that resulted in us starting a separate club for our red wine members only.
Now, there's 5 clubs here at Nicholson Ranch.
We produce Pinot, Chardonnay, Merlot, and Syrah. All our club members know that. And depending on what suits your taste, people join different clubs. Our signature club features Chardonnay and Pinot every time, 4 times a year, and occasionally a Merlot. That's what we're going to feature today, talk about today. The most recent wine club we sent out is this month in February and consists of 3 different wines. One is our 2018 La Colina Chardonnay, followed by a 2018 Sonoma Coast Pinot, and finishing up with our 2017 777 Pinot.
I poured the Chardonnay in the glasses.
Oh, thank you. Actually, I'm going to backtrack before I start sipping, and we start talking about how this wine tastes.
Okay.
If you're a club member, please feel free to open a bottle and taste along with us. We appreciate your patience and humor and just keeping along with us here. I told you how our wine club sort of started.
Right.
But over time, what I have realized is it's not just a wine club. It is really, for me, a community of like-minded, clearly people who like the same wines. In our case, our Nicholson Ranch Chardonnay, Pinot, and so on. But they also turn out to be very, very interesting people overall. Over the last 20 years, I've got to know many of our wine club members quite well. Some have become like family that I see regularly and talk to regularly and exchange notes. So every conversation I have with our wine club members, I walk away feeling a little bit smarter, which is when I was young, I had a job in software and I used to travel and used to go in, different places and so on. And I don't do that much anymore, except on a vacation. I'm really just at the location, Nicholson Ranch. So it's great to be able to meet people who have traveled from somewhere else, from different walks of life, with different interests, who are very open to just having a conversation and sharing it over a nice glass of wine.
It's like a really extended family, because we've got almost 2,000 people in the club. And a lot of them live here in the Bay Area. And then another huge chunk of them live all over the country. They visited the winery at one time or another and signed up because they want to get these wines. And we do not, we're a what's known as a direct-to-consumer winery now. So there's no distribution in restaurants or stores. So if you want these wines, you have to know somebody. You have to come buy the wines here. And an easy way to keep them flowing into your house and keep them in your wine rack all the time is through the club.
Yeah, so today all our wines are sold almost directly to our wine club and to people who come visit here. We don't sell through any distributors or stores or restaurants. And it's a really old-fashioned way of, I guess, doing business. People come to your door, they taste the product, they like it, they purchase it. If they like it enough, they come back again. So when we talk about selling wine, there's a lot more to it than the word sell. It's really building a relationship with each of our customers, and it's more than just talking about building a relationship. What I found that it just happens. People who like our wine keep coming back, and I have the opportunity to become friends with them and extended family and build that relationship.
The thing you mentioned about feeling like when you talk to wine club members, you learn things and you become smarter. I touched on that in the last episode with Russell. My experience when I first started visiting wineries in my 20s was that I started meeting people, and not just the people working in the wineries, but the people that were also visiting the wineries were new kinds of people for me to be hanging out with.
And two other very common elements each of you would identify with. Most people who like wine love food.
Yes.
Love good food.
Yes.
And then the other one, most people like wine, love traveling as well.
That's right.
So those are two of the things I enjoy. So I enjoy anybody who likes wine.
If you're in the Nicholson Ranch Club, you most likely received your box of wine last week. Or if you pick your wine up at the winery and haven't yet, what is stopping you? We are open again. The ban on outdoor tastings has been lifted, and we are open, and it's going to be a beautiful weekend. And we're in for some nice weather into February. I know you obsess about the extended forecast.
Yeah, no,
things are looking good right now.
A lot of sunny weather. The flip side of it is not enough rain, and that's not good for California. But us in wine country, the plants, the vines, the grapevines themselves are very drought tolerant. And usually in a low rain year, or should I call it drought year, the quality of the fruit actually tends to be better. Going back a few years from 2013 all the way to 2016, we had pretty severe drought in some of those years. And each of those vintages, the quality of the fruit has just been exceptional. Many of you have been partaking of our sales of the 2014 vintage. That was a drought year as well. And that's why there's a lot of concentration in the flavor of that wine. And also the tannins that were there when the wine was young has allowed that wine to age and soften up. And 7 years later, it still tastes very fresh and youthful.
You're making me thirsty.
Okay, then let's sip on some of our first wine, we're going to start off with a Chardonnay.
This is the La Colina Chardonnay from 2018. It's one of the reserve Chardonnays made here at Nicholson Ranch. And originally, this was made just for the wine club. I think it's still just a wine club wine. It goes out to the club.
Just a wine club wine.
You talk about small production. This is a very small production wine. A little over 100 cases? 200 cases?
Yeah, about 170.
So this is one of those wines that is not, you're not going to see it on the grocery store shelves because there's just not that much of it. We don't sell any of the wine at the grocery stores, but if you think about how the wines get to the grocery stores, and they get to the grocery stores all over the country through these massive distribution links, that's hundreds of thousands of cases produced of the same wine every year. So this, you get it down to under 200 cases, it's pretty special.
What actually just struck me, so as Mike said, we're taping this podcast in the vintner's room. Almost all of you have visited the winery, and the vintner's room is a room right next to the front patio where you have the beautiful panoramic view. The interesting thing is the wine we're drinking, La Colina, grows right in front of that patio.
That's right.
So we are sitting maybe 50 feet away from this vineyard, from the La Colina vineyard.
Now you're making people very jealous.
Well, it's just, all our vineyards are right here. We have 30 acres of grapes around here, but 30 acres, some of the vineyards you still have to walk about a half mile to get to them. but they're right here. So this one happens to be the closest vineyard to the winery building. Yeah.
That's right. You can almost reach out and touch the vines. The La Colina Chardonnay, it's a Chardonnay, and the first thing I get on the nose is that blast of tropical fruit. First tropical fruit that comes to mind for me is pineapple, but it's not just pineapple. It's almost like a muted pineapple, almost getting into like something sort of waxy smelling and very juicy smelling.
Right.
Like I would say lychee nut.
Lychee nut, star fruit. Like
star fruit.
Even like a kiwi, hint of kiwi as well.
I get that, yeah.
So wine tasting, and for me, a lot of it is really all in the nose, is the aroma. So I love swirling the glass, having a nice big glass, having maybe 2 or 3 ounces of wine in a nice big glass so I can swirl without spilling. Yeah, I've been known to spill as well.
You got to be careful.
But I love swirling the wine. As a side note, many, many years ago, when my oldest son Xander was a 2-year-old, maybe 3-year-old, something like that. And I found that he was swirling his sippy cup. I was like, wow, I must swirl my glass a lot. Then my kid picked this up and is swirling his sippy cup.
It's a thing. Once you get the habit of swirling your wine, pretty soon you're swirling your coffee, you're swirling everything you're drinking.
But with wine, it really has, it's not just a stylistic thing. It really has an objective. You're blending air. You're blending in oxygen. And that oxygen is what reacts with the compounds that are in wine and then releases the aromas. Releases those aromas, tropical aromas of kiwi and starfruit and pineapple. Let's smell. I'm going to smell this again.
That's why it's nice to have a nice big glass. Like you said, the aroma is pretty much everything. After that, once the wine gets in your mouth, for me, it's like, okay, it tastes like it smells. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes there's something, right. You get some kind of an inversion and there's a flavor in there that you didn't expect. But once it hits your mouth, for me, it's okay. It tastes really good. How does it feel?
But before we get to that, so let's smell the aromas once again and see if we're smelling anything different. I get a little bit of flowers, and it's a white flower, like a citrus flower, lemon or orange flower, or maybe even a jasmine.
And then what about the oak influence? This wine spent more than the normal time in barrel, correct?
Correct. Usually this wine, in all our reserve Chardonnays, all are aged, fermented and aged all in French oak. A large percentage of the barrels are brand new. In the case of the La Colina, roughly about half the barrels were brand new. So there is a good amount of oak influence. So I'll talk a little bit about that, and then why do we use some new barrels and what are the other barrels that we use. When you smell the wine, you may get a hint of a toasty note, or a hint of caramel or butterscotch, kind of burnt sugar, but just a hint of it. And that's something that you get, an aroma that you pick up from a barrel. The other very distinct barrel aroma is vanilla. And you will very often get it in both white and red wines. And that's, again, a contribution of the barrel. But in addition for the aroma, I think the bigger contribution of the barrel is texture. So let's go ahead, sip on it, and think about flavors and texture. And we'll talk a little more about barrel aging.
So traditionally, the Chardonnay spent 18 months in barrel. And this particular wine, as well as the next wine we're going to taste, both from the 2018 vintage, were ready to have served their time in barrel and be bottled this past spring in April. And then something happened in the world that caused a lot of things to stop or be delayed. And that bottling schedule was delayed. We didn't get to bottle the wines that we were intending to bottle in April and June of this past spring until just a few months ago in November and December. So the first two wines we're going to taste, this Chardonnay and then the next one, which is a Pinot, were bottled later than they had been planned to be bottled. So this one ended up 24 months?
26 months.
26 months as opposed to 18.
As opposed to 18, yeah.
Well, nothing bad happened because it's delicious.
No. I mean, in fact, some very often longer time in barrel is going to provide more texture. So as we talked about, what a barrel does to a wine is it allows the wine to breathe. Breathing means the wine is slowly evaporating through the wood of the barrel, and it absorbs tiny amounts of oxygen. So they call it micro-oxygenation. And the chemistry of that allows the wine, the aromas to develop and the texture to smooth out. The same wine, had it been fermented in a steel tank, it would taste pretty tart on the tongue and kind of almost prickly on the tongue. You would really feel it. So same wine sitting in a barrel, and it could be an old barrel, doesn't have to be a new barrel, is going to smooth out. The texture is going to be nice and silky. What that means is you're going to let it be on your palate, stay in your mouth a little longer. And if you leave it in your mouth even a couple of seconds longer, what that results in, the wine evaporates in your mouth. And so you get this burst of flavor and aroma in your mouth. Had that wine been prickly and tart, you're likely to just swallow it fast to get it off your palate because it's annoying your palate. But a nice silky wine, a barrel-aged Chardonnay, you're going to let it linger. And I use the word, I think, luxuriate. And truly it is.
Because of the texture, and a lot of that texture comes from all that time spent in the barrel. And this wine is very, I always say creamy. That's what it feels like to me. It feels like something very soft and almost cream-like, because it has that viscous feel.
Yeah.
When you have, if you take a sip of heavy cream.
The texture of the wine, I said the barrel contributes to texture, but there are a few other things that actually do as well. One is how you ferment it. In our case, we ferment our wine with our native yeast. So it's yeast from the vineyard. And each yeast, the type of yeast that ferments it, has an impact both on aroma, but also on the texture of the wine. Everybody knows the fermentation means the yeast eats sugar and they make alcohol. And the primary alcohol is ethanol. But the yeast make more than just ethanol. They make other alcohols, which are generally called higher alcohols. And they're alcohol as well, but they have kind of more stuffing around them. If you can imagine these alcohol molecules, they tend to be bigger molecules than ethanol. What that results in is a little viscosity, as Mike said, in the wine. So every yeast does a different proportion of these different higher alcohols and produce different texture to the wine as well. Another component of texture is called malolactic or malolactic fermentation. And that happens with the bacteria. That's the second fermentation that happens to almost all wines, or that we allow to happen with all wines. Most Chardonnays have gone through malolactic. Some whites like Pinot Grigio and Sauvignon Blanc, typically people do not have them go through malolactic. They want them to be crisp and tart. But if you want a creamy wine, so that creamy aspect Mike was talking about comes solely from the malolactic fermentation. So this Chardonnay went through full ML, short for malolactic, and that's why it has this creamy aspect to it.
You almost only hear people talk about malolactic fermentation in terms of Chardonnay. All red wines go through malolactic fermentation. But of the whites, Chardonnay is sort of the big one, that it's really used as a tool to create that creaminess. And like you said, with a Sauvignon Blanc, you want something crisp and lighter, fruity, no malolactic fermentation.
While we've been talking about it, the flavor of this wine is kind of just echoing in my mouth. And I was like, what am I tasting? And it just reminds me of pears, pear juice, apples, a little bit of tropical fruit mixed in, maybe a little bit of peach, pineapple for sure, what we smelled in the aroma. And that flavor is just reverberating all around my mouth. And these wines, the Chardonnay, though it's a white wine, I tend to savor it, sip it, swirl it. Great wine by itself, but also delicious with dinner. Mike, what would you pair this wine with?
What comes to mind immediately is the way that I prepare fish when I'm cooking at home, and I do most of the cooking at my house, and I'm always trying to come up with ways to make my food more interesting and flavorful. I've developed a method of cooking tilapia, which is a white fish, basically searing it in olive oil and butter and white wine, And before I put it in the pan, I coat it with freshly chopped Italian parsley to give the fish a savory note. And of course, ample amounts of sea salt. And so I start the pan with just butter and olive oil, and I add the fish. And then about halfway through cooking the fish, I add a little wine and let the wine reduce down with the fish. This wine right here would be a real amazing pairing with that particular dish. I don't have a lot of hard, fast rules. You know, the old rules people always used to say, white wine with fish, red wine with red meat. I think we've moved well beyond that now. Think about your whole palate. Think about the types of food you crave and the types of wine you crave. And it turns out, I think, this is my theory, that most people can pair their food and their wine just by imagining what they want to eat and what they want to drink. What about you? What do you want with this wine?
You know, I agree with Mike. In my house, my wife Nancy is the one who does most of the cooking, and she's a really talented cook. I mean, she's just self-taught and tries different things, and we eat a lot of fish in the house, so many different kinds. We've had the Chardonnay with many different kinds of fish, but I particularly like it with kind of fish that's a white fish that is have strong flavors. Recently, we've been eating a black cod that we've been getting from a farmer's market. Just, I think they catch it off the coast over here. And it's kind of a little fishy fish. The Chardonnay certainly matches up really well with this fish. The fish is also a little bit fatty. Not as fatty as maybe a sea bass, or even not as fatty as a salmon. Having a nice acidic wine, it actually opens up the fat and gives you more flavor. The way wine and fat interact, it actually augments it, and 2 + 2 gives you something actually more than 4. Besides the pairing aspect in terms of which flavor matches up, I think just a combination of a good wine and good food just melds together and just creates something that is unique.
That's something that I used to tell people in restaurants. I said, don't tell anybody, but I think you can do it yourself by ordering what you like to eat and what you like to drink at the same time. Because think about it. You're drinking good wine and you're eating good food. How could you not just be having a great time? All right. I have moved on to the next wine.
Okay. I've got another sip or two. I'm going to savor this and we'll move on to the next wine.
The next wine is a Pinot Noir from 2018. And same deal. It was one of those wines that was in barrel, ready to be bottled last April when the pandemic hit. So this wine spent 27 months in oak. This is the 2018 Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir. Comes from the Pinot vines at the far north end of the property. So we can't see them from where we are here in the vintner's room. We're not quite as close to the vines as we are with the Chardonnay vines.
Yeah, but we walk out onto the patio. It's a little west of us, about a quarter mile to a half mile due west of us, so we can certainly peek at the vines from here. Right now, February, the vines are dormant. We have been pruning the vineyard, which means cutting off the old branches, getting the structure of the plant ready for the next vintage. In early March, we'll have leaves coming out. In May, we have flowers that come out, little grape flowers that's really tiny. If somebody hasn't pointed out a grape flower to you, you may not even notice it because it does not really have any petals at all. And it doesn't need petals because it doesn't need a pollinator like bees. It's self-pollinating. So the flower is not showy. It doesn't have any flair to it. It doesn't really have much aroma to it.
Well,
that's why you wouldn't notice it.
Very small.
And that's why you wouldn't notice it.
Very close to the vines to even notice the flowers.
But there are many of them. And each of these little flowers, if they're pollinated, they become a berry. So that's how you get a whole bunch of berries on a cluster. You may have as many as 100 berries on a cluster. So that cluster probably started with 150 flowers on it. And the bunch is smaller than your fist or my fist. So you can imagine how small these flowers are. Many of them get pollinated and become a berry sometime in June. And from June through the summer months, the heat and the sunshine and the water that they absorb from the ground is going to make these berries grow bigger and large and then get sweeter with time and develop flavors before we harvest them in September and October.
It's so much fun to be here while all of that is happening. It really is. As somebody who, before I started working here, had been a wine drinker for many, many years, being here through that whole cycle is just It's really incredible. On the nose, this Pinot,
We're swirling the 2018 Sonoma Coast Pinot.
this really is giving me lots and lots of cola, which is a fun thing to say because some people say, what does that mean? Cola. Like, well, think about if you smell a Coca-Cola, but you take out the fizzy factor and most of all that high fructose corn syrup.
Correct. Yeah.
You think about that smell that you get and that taste you get when you drink a Coca-Cola. This Pinot has a ton of that on the nose.
I think cola is pretty distinct in many Pinots. And Pinots will vary a lot depending on where they're grown and how they're made. Our Pinots, Nicholson Ranch Pinots, will always kind of have this cola nose. And the other aroma that I usually detect tends to be an orange peel, just orange zest a little bit. Or sometimes it's stronger, sometimes it's lighter, but it does show up. I smell cinnamon.
Definitely cinnamon.
I smell cinnamon, behind that cola. The cinnamon over there.
You get cinnamon. I get it kind of turns in from cola. It kind of goes into like a black tea note. And of course, there's this really nice low note of some kind of cherry fruit that's very dark in color. At least that's the way I envision it when I smell this wine.
Mike made a note about tea. And I'm from India. There's a lot of tea drunk in India, as you know. So I always make the connection with aromas with tea. Our sense memory, especially our sense of smell memory, goes way back into our childhood. You've heard the cliche, which goes, it smells like grandma's attic. And people that pops up in people's minds. But it's true, our sense memory goes way back. People who do analysis on aromas, they break it down in machines and break it down to what the chemicals are that are producing these aromas. And they find that the wine that may be giving you tea aroma is exactly the same chemical as what gives tea the tea aroma.
Next time you're having a nice glass of Pinot, think about that. How's the texture?
Very silky. It's amazing because it's a fairly young wine. It's a 2018, so 2 years and change. It's still pretty silky. You can feel the tannins. And when I say feel the tannins, after I've swallowed the wine, sipped the wine, if I rub my tongue over the roof of my mouth, that's when you're going to feel a little more roughness. Just in the case of Pinot, just a hint of roughness.
Just a little bit. Pinot is a fairly low tannin grape, but in a young Pinot, you're going to get a little bit of it, and that's the drying effect in your mouth. And the other effect is your mouth is watering from the acidity in the wine. And that's what I'm sitting here enjoying right now. I'm enjoying the nice mouth-watering finish. I get that cherry. I get that cola. It's still in my mouth, and it's going and going and going. These wines have amazing finishes on them.
On the palate in the mouth, you get a lot of cherry. You get pomegranate in there. Some elements of raspberry juice. Fresh raspberries as well. Sometimes you smell a little bit of the bush in it as well. So, the leaves almost. And with Pinot, sometimes you get a hint of that. Not just the fruit, but the plant itself. Some people describe that as kind of an earthiness, and that may be the case. And people describe it very often as forest floor.
Right. I love that term.
Moss.
Forest floor.
Or wet moss. But, you can recreate that if you take a hike in the woods, really, if there's a lot of foliage around there, so the ground is kind of still a little moist, hasn't dried out. There's a certain aroma that emanates from the soil. And some of that is just what is called dirt. Some people may call it mushroom. Some people call it forest floor. Forest floor.
You just think of all the things that have fallen onto the floor of the forest from the trees and then been covered up with more stuff that's fallen from the trees. And eventually some of it starts to get really moist, and it might even be starting to decompose a little bit. And it's that smell.
Again, one of those very distinct things about Pinot is getting that earthy, that wet moss, forest floor, mushroom. And anytime you ever get that nose in a wine, it's a Pinot. It's very unlikely it's any other varietal. The closest I've actually got to Pinot that may have a little bit of that is Italian varietal Sangiovese.
Okay.
And sometimes you can get that in there too.
I think sometimes the Barbarescos have a little bit of that going
Could
on.
be,
Because
yeah.
they're a little bit exotic. You know,
Yeah, the
Barbaresco is not a hugely heavy wine, but it has a lot of variance to the flavors. A lot of stuff that's not just plain, oh, this is fruity. It's
Right.
got a lot of that non-fruit flavor. And then I like to say it veers out into that realm of the exotic where you can't really place it.
Barbaresco, the grape that Barbaresco is the town where the wine comes from. The grape that makes that wine is called Nebbiolo. And also Italian varietal from northern Italy, the Piedmont region, makes beautiful wines. Barbaresco is a fine example. Barolo, many people know of Barolos. But any grape made from Nebbiolo, any wine made from Nebbiolo are just aromatic, delicious, not just fruit forward, but have this savory, earthy component to it as well.
Rustic, another good word. So this is the 2018 Sonoma Coast Pinot.
What spice notes do you get on this? I know mentioned cinnamon. On the palate, it's a little different. More towards clove or nutmeg.
It's in that sort of all spicy family. The spices you use if you're going to mull cider in the wintertime.
One other question that I get often, and so especially with young wine, is very pertinent, is should I let the wine breathe before drinking it? What do you think, Mike? Should we let this wine breathe, which means decant it maybe an hour earlier and sip it later? Would you think would benefit this wine?
You know, my answer to that is always based on your own personal preference. Some people really enjoy popping it, pouring it, and drinking it. They love that just big, fresh flavor. But if you do decant this wine a few hours before you are going to drink it, it's going to open up a little bit. Of course, it could have benefited from a little bit of decanting, and this one's going to be amazing with some bottle age too.
The Nicholson Ranch Pinots, for sure, a couple of years of bottle age.
I mean, in our terms, this wine is just a little baby. Yeah. It's just been birthed, and it's just going to grow and develop just like people do and have a lot more to say. When they're babies, they're cute, but they don't have as much to say.
This is going to have a lot more aroma, so if you like aromas and the complexity and the variety of aromas, drink a younger Nicholson Ranch Pinot. But the same bottle 2 years later, so our current 2016, I would say our 2015 and 2014, those three vintages to me are like just the right combination of aroma, texture, flavor. The aroma is a little more subdued, not as easy, I would say, to identify or take apart. Like on the 2018, we talk about cinnamon, we talk about rose, talk about orange peel. In the older wines, let's say the 2014 or 2015, those aromas are kind of integrated, so they just kind of blended together. So I can say I smell it, I like it. It's a little bit harder to pull apart.
It's not as easy to discern the details because all the flavors are really just getting woven together, and that gives you a whole different kind of wine, a wine that you might describe as more mellow. And again, back to personal preference. People ask all the time, how long should we age this wine? I say, well, how do you like it? How do you want it to be when you open it? If you want it to be big and just effusive, then drink it when it's young. If you like something a little more mellow, that has a more broad base of flavors that you sort of have to just let roll over you in waves, but in a little more gentle way. You know, the younger wines, they kind of slap you around a little bit. Wines that have been aging, they're more like that good dog you've owned for 10 years and it sits by you and it's super loyal and it's super mellow and, you know, it doesn't want to go play fetch as often, but it's such a nice mellow dog.
Yeah, I tend to like most of my wines, white or red, with a little bit of age. When I say a little bit of age, usually I'd say 5 to 7 years. When you get to some of the bigger reds, our Merlot, for example, or Cabernet coming in from Napa, I'd say 7 to 10 years almost on those wines.
Or Syrah.
I think, you know, there's a little, it's got a long finish. There's a hint of bitterness in the finish, and that's, again, indicative of more a young wine. Mm-hmm. And that's what will go away. That bitterness would go away in the finish, leaving it very sweet and silky. Very often, so if you open one of our older wines from 14, 15, or 16, the finish will actually have a little sweet taste to it. The sweetness does not come from sugar. Our wines have no sugar. We measure it, and in an entire bottle of wine, there may be less than a half gram of sugar.
All the sugar is gone. It's been eaten by the yeast and turned into alcohol.
But what makes it taste sweet is the combination of the flavors. You're getting this raspberry cherry flavor and texture, which is smooth and creamy. And if you think of any sweet, desserty kind of things, they have those two. They have like good, strong flavor, usually strong fruit flavor, and they have creaminess to it. The third thing, desserts always have a sugar, which wine does not. However, 2 out of 3 tends to fool your palate into thinking sweet, sweet. Mike, if any of our club members are listening, or for that matter, anybody who's listening.
Anybody, one person, please.
Yes. If they have any questions about, or comments on what they taste, or if they have any questions about our winemaking or anything we're talking about, where should they send an email or question to?
Well, you can email me at tallmikewine@gmail.com. Very simple. Very easy.
We'd love to send an email over to Mike, and you can address it to me, Deepak, as well. I'll be happy to respond to it as well.
I've moved on to the next wine. I have the next wine in my glass. It has a black label on it, and on the black label it says Nicholson Ranch 777. People always want to know, what's that 777? What does it mean? Is this the wine I want to drink when I'm in Vegas? It's another Pinot Noir called the 777. Now, Deepak's going to tell us why it's called the 777.
With Pinot, there are many different varieties of Pinot. They're like just shades of the same color, but they're shades. So there are many different types of Pinot, each of which originated in a vineyard somewhere in France. Pinot is one of the oldest continuously propagated, continuously grown varietals for 1,000 years. So people in France, and since then the rest of the world, have grown this grape, cultivated it, observed it, followed it, and every little quirk, every little thing that was different about it allowed that to be expressed in terms of wine. And if a farmer or winemaker found that a certain Pinot coming from a certain row had a slightly different taste, and they liked that, they took a cutting off that vine and planted it on another piece of land. And that's how you get different varieties of Pinot. A few decades ago, since people were doing this anyway, the University of Dijon, which is similar to UC Davis over here and does a lot of research into viticulture, which is the science of grapes, decided to classify all these different varietals of Pinot. You think the French are romantics, but when it came to naming these different varietals, they gave them numbers, which I find very surprising. So they acted like scientists,
right,
and gave them numbers. So the one that the wine we're tasting comes from a variety of Pinot. They call them clones, which was given the number 777 by University of Dijon.
To demystify the whole thing, when you're drinking Pinot Noir, you're typically drinking a blend of different varieties within the Pinot Noir family. And most of the time you're drinking a blend of 2 or 3 or more. Here at Nicholson Ranch, we have 14 acres of Pinot. We have 5 clones planted. And all of our Pinots are a blend of at least 2 of them, except this one. Why did you decide you wanted to take the 777 and isolate it? What is it about the 777 clone that you wanted to make a single clone bottling?
So with any wine, I'd say any beverage, there's some components that need to be there. I think tends to have that structure. 1 is aroma, 2 is flavor, and 3 is texture. And the reason we and any winemaker blend different varieties of Pinot, or sometimes blend different kinds of grapes, is to create all those 3 elements in the wine: aroma, flavor, texture, because they may not get all of that in that one variety of Pinot Noir. Our 777 for many years, and probably well over a decade, was one of the primary components of our Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir, the wine we just tasted before this. But over time, what we started noticing is that the 777 was showing distinctive aroma, definitely had flavor, and most importantly, that texture and the finish was developing kind of slightly different angle almost. And so we isolated, kept aside 8 different barrels off the 777, and then tasted it after 20 months of aging and tasted it alongside the Sonoma coast and found that the wine was really distinct and separate. And so since then, I think 2015.
2015 was the first one. Yes, 2015.
We did the 777. So remember in 2015, the grapevine itself was 20 years old. I started planting these grapes in 1995. So it took till middle age. 20 years old is really literally middle age for a grapevine before this clone really started expressing itself. So you could call it a late bloomer. Some of us find our calling much later in life, myself included.
You're trying to figure things out. I'm just out here in the vineyard. I don't know what I want to be. But when you get to be a certain age, I know who I am now.
I mean, I became a full-time vintner, winemaker in my early 40s. I'm 58 years old now, and 2003 is when we opened the winery. I'd started playing with wine as a hobby many years earlier, but as a young person, it was more just the fun of it. Making something with your hands and meeting new people and so on was more the objective, I guess. And I wasn't trying to perfect or try to make the best wine, but I would say in the last 20 years, it certainly kind of pulled me in. It kind of found, or it found me. The calling found me.
If you're listening to this podcast for the first time and you want to know more about Deepak's story, go back to episode number 1. We talk all about Deepak's history and how he came to be who he is now. You know what I get on this wine? You said this clone is used as part of the blend of the Sonoma coast, which we just tasted. Mm-hmm. So I do get that black tea. Mm-hmm. I get that cola, but what really starts to come in, sort of nudging in from the side, is a little more fruit. And the fruit that I like to say it is raspberry.
So what was distinct is the content it has, what the Sonoma coast has, just more concentrated.
Right. So this is one component of that previous wine, and it's just singing its own song. And that song, to me, has a little more raspberry going on, kind of almost like what you would say is not one of those farm-grown raspberries that you buy at Whole Foods, but the wild raspberry. When you go off to some super rural area and you find a patch of raspberries just growing out there and they're covered with dust, and you know that nobody's doing anything to them. They're just growing, and they grow every year. And if you're lucky enough to find them when they're at the peak of ripeness, they have this really juicy fruit flavor, but also kind of a brambly thing going on.
The French make raspberry liqueur called framboise. So that reminds me of this, and you can put a dash of it's super sweet, so you don't want to sip the framboise by itself. But you put a dash of it in either bland white wine or sparkling wine, and you get just a wonderful wine champagne cocktail.
That's right.
It's fairly common, so you've heard of Bellinis, which is peach nectar juice put in Prosecco. Mm-hmm. So it's a similar concept. And in France, in Burgundy, specifically Burgundy, the common drink is to put black currant liqueur, which is called cassis or creme de cassis, into either a still bland wine or a champagne, and you call it kir. If you put it in a champagne, it's called kir royale.
Now that is old school. You're talking about an really old school
That's
drink.
Really old school. But interestingly, Pinot, which comes from Burgundy, very often will have this flavor of cassis as well, which is black currants. And, it always makes you all these flavors from a region, different beverages, in this case wine or kir, all the foods have some complementary aspects to it. And as I think what it has to do a lot with what Mike's talking about is in your mind, you pair these things anyway, and you start eating and drinking things that you like. When a community of people do the same thing, suddenly you have, this is our We get Pinot Noir from Burgundy, and then you get Kir from Burgundy.
And you talking about Burgundy and the mushroomy smell makes me think of cheese, also from Burgundy. There's a cheese called Epoisse.
Oh boy!
And talk about mushrooms. Talk about mushrooms. Talk about stinky cheese. But it's so amazing. It's got such great earthy and just big flavors to it. That's what I want to pair with this wine right here, the 777.
I'll share a pet peeve, though, talking about wine and cheese. Yes, wine and cheese go really well together. It's a great experience and all of that. But anytime somebody tells me, this wine is really good, but try it with this cheese, it's even better. I go the opposite direction. I'm going, that wine is really good. It should just taste good on its own. And if you tell me try it with a piece of cheese, you're essentially telling me the wine isn't good enough.
Well, that's,
that's my pet peeve when people say wine and cheese.
We talk about old world wines, and some of them are a little higher in acidity. And when you point that out to somebody, they'll say, oh, it's because it's a great food wine, because cheese or something fatty is going to coat your tongue and sort of tamper down that acidity. And like you say, well, why does it need that? There must be something wrong with it if we can't just drink it by itself.
The key to winemaking and the key to anybody appreciating wine or any beverage, any cocktail, is finding that right balance. Having enough acidity that you can pair it with food, but having not so much acidity that you can't sip it and enjoy it by itself. The third element that acidity does, and that's, you can only appreciate on a longer time scale, is allows the wine to age. If that wine did not have acidity, it is not going to age.
It's just a balancing act. And that acidity, it makes your mouth water when you swallow the wine, gives you that finish. Makes you ready for the next bite of food or the next sip of that wine. If you were sipping that wine and it's got that nice fruit flavor and you swallowed it and then it disappeared, that's not really giving you the full experience. And it's that acidity that carries through, makes your mouth water, and gives you that finish.
This 777 for sure is not disappearing anytime soon. No. It just lingers, hangs out there on your palate, on your tongue. You can just taste it. It gives you that really concentrated fruit flavor. Dried cherries, the flavor of dried cherries just hangs out in your mouth.
For Pinot Noirs, this is a bigger style of Pinot. This 777 is got a lot to say. It's a little heavier.
What contributes a lot to making it heavier and having more flavor is getting really concentrated juice. And the way we get the juice to concentrate is by dry farming. So the 777 that goes into this bottling, all those plants were also dry farmed. So no irrigation in the growing season at all, just dependent on the natural rainfall that comes in winter. Which brings me back to this winter. Today is February 5th. And I think we've had 8 inches of rainfall in the rainy season so far, which is less than a third of our normal rainfall. So people are very careful about using the D word for drought out here in California, but I think that's where we're heading in 2021. It's probably another drought year, which, as I said before, from a winemaking point of view, is actually a good thing. For most of us who live in California, not so good.
It's part of the cycle, though. The drought comes, the drought goes. We do hope we have a little bit more rain before we get into the bulk of the summertime. But who knows? Who knows what's going to happen? All right, that's the 777. If you have these wines at home, you've gotten your wine shipment from Nicholson Ranch, you're probably ready to just break these open now. Hopefully you're excited to drink them. If you don't have them and you want to join the wine club, you can do that by going to the Nicholson Ranch website at nicholsonranch.com. Deepak, thank you so much for sitting in. Yes?
Yeah.
Here we go.
And I look forward to sharing a glass with all of you when you come visit.
Yes. And again, we're open.
Thank you. Thanks for allowing us to enjoy a great afternoon sipping wine. This is work, folks. This is work, and we're working hard.
That's right. We're working hard. The Tall Mike Wine Podcast is written, produced, edited, and maintained by yours truly. Our main theme is written by Jeremy Marzin. The podcast is recorded on a program called Audacity. If you'd like to give us feedback, I mentioned it before, but I'll say it again. My email address is tallmikewine@gmail.com. You can find me on Twitter and tweet at me at tallmikewine69. And you can check out pictures of things, including lots of wine and food. And I took a picture of us just before we started recording. And it's on Instagram. Right now, my Instagram handle is tallmikewine. Until next time, from the Vintner's Room at Nicholson Ranch, cheers.
Thank you.